Here coming up in just a moment. We've got Fox 13's Kayla Solomon there live inside the courtroom. She's the one listening to all this. And as far as Bean goes, I mean, it was the defense who laid out a pretty compelling case that Officer Bean was not compliant with a lot of this, even though he did fall under the obstruction of justice guilty verdict. John Keith Perry talking on behalf of Tadarius Bean, the testimony of the former Scorpion Unit officer, most referred to him as quiet, and that Bean was the newest member of the team.
Okay.
We are now learning the other former Memphis police officer, Demetrius Haley, has been found guilty on count 3 and 4. Count 3 is conspiracy to witness tamper. Count 4 is obstruction of justice. Again, Demetrius Haley found guilty on 2 counts, 3 and 4, conspiracy to witness tamper and obstruction of justice, which means that he was found not guilty at this point on excessive force and failure to intervene and deliberate indifference. So at this point, we are still waiting on the third suspect, which at this point is Justin Smith.
Justin Smith. So again, to repeat, guilty on obstruction of justice, guilty on the conspiracy to obstruct justice. Of course, that conspiracy charge kind of creates a larger umbrella. That means that the officers conspired with each other in this case to talk about the case on the scene, and a lot of that played out on body cam video. You saw that. You saw those officers talking to each other and seeming, look, we're not litigating this case here on the air, but they seem to begin constructing their own narrative as opposed to exactly what was played out there on the videotape, that body cam and the tower cam of the beating of Tyre Nichols. Of course, that beating happened back on January 7th. It was a Saturday night in 2023.
We're also learning that Demetrius Haley, again, we said he was guilty on the 2 counts, conspiracy to witness tamper and obstruction of justice, which was count 4, but we're learning that he was found guilty of 2 lesser charges, deprivation of rights and bodily injury. Again, we're still waiting on anything that's coming down for Justin Smith. He is the other suspect involved in this.
And we just got word just a second ago, Justin Smith, guilty only of count 4, obstruction of justice, meaning the civil rights violations, the unreasonable force use and deliberate indifference, not guilty on that charge, as well as not guilty on conspiracy charges. So Justin Smith, former officer Justin Smith, found guilty only on count 4, the obstruction of justice charge.
Again, this whole thing started with 5 former Memphis police officers, Emmett Martin, Desmond Mills, Justin Smith, Tadarius Bean, and Demetrius Haley. We know that Emmett Martin and Desmond Mills, they pleaded guilty early on this year, in fact.
They did, and they actually were quite detrimental to the defense in this case because they in turn testified on behalf of the prosecution against Bean, Haley, and Smith. Of course, this is wrapping up almost 4 full weeks in the courtroom for those jurors, of course, for Judge Mark Norris, who's presided over this, and the attorneys, 3 sets of defense attorneys, and of course the prosecution on behalf of the Department of Justice. Interesting to say the least, these verdicts that are coming down. I dare say this is not exactly what we expected.
It's definitely not what we expected based on the video that MPD released. I believe that was at the end of January where they actually released the video.
It was very shortly after the beating.
Right. Based on the video, many people felt that the actions of the officers were very excessive. But clearly what happened in court today, the jury determined something different.
Well, and again, we saw this. You've seen this play out time and time again. It's been available online, and of course, we brought it to you first here, Fox 13, when it was first released. You've seen it. You've been able to pass your own judgment. Part of this goes out to the fact that they brought in force or use of force experts, and many of those, many of the parts of the testimony by that use of force expert pointed to the fact that they did seem to be compliant in some ways
with policy.
With policy, and that's where, you know, if you go back shortly after the Tyre Nichols beating and after his death, there were many calls for a complete investigation. Matter of fact, there has been a complete investigation into the Memphis Police Department, the Scorpion Unit, that all 5 members of that particular team were members of the Scorpion Unit. That has since been disbanded. That's now no longer part of the the arsenal, if you will, of the MPD. So a lot has happened since January 7th of 2023, but again, so far, only obstruction of justice and conspiracy to obstruct justice charges against these individuals. Of course, we don't know the sentencing yet.
Right.
That's yet to happen. That's going to be handed down by Judge Mark Norris, I believe.
That we're waiting at this point.
There we go. Here are the maximum
There we go.
penalties. That's what we were going to go to there. For the unreasonable force, the deliberate indifference, life in prison was possible. Now, again, just because the life in prison sentences are off the table here, that does not mean that these officers are not facing significant prison time. Because as you see on the screen, the conspiracy to obstruct justice carries a maximum of 20 years. The obstruction charge itself also carries a maximum of 20 years. It'll be interesting on the two that were found on Bean and Haley. Both of those were found guilty on both of those bottom counts. If those particular sentences will be run concurrent, or if they will be separate sentences. If so, that could be up to 40 years for each officer as a maximum.
Mind you, this is the state case. This is the federal case. They're still facing state charges as well, which I believe is second-degree murder for that.
Right.
So there's still some other charges that they're facing that's coming down the pipeline here.
Yeah, that state trial is set to begin sometime early next year. They wanted to wait until this federal trial wrapped up and give the defense attorneys and, of course, the prosecution on behalf of Shelby County time to vet all of the outcome of this, get this tidied away, and then move into that state court. Right after that, you'll see the third civil trial, and that third civil trial will not begin until sometime. They're predicting sometime early next year. That will be after the state trial as well. That's where the family of Tyre Nichols is seeking $550 million in damages against not only the city of Memphis, but also other individuals named in that case, including the 5 officers.
Again, we're talking about 3 officers tonight: Justin Smith, Tadarius Bean, and Demetrius Haley. We know that Emmett Martin and Desmond Mills, they have already pled guilty, but these are the other 3 officers that are tied to the Tyre Nichols beating. Just for clarification for you tonight, Tadarius Bean, guilty on count 4, which was obstruction of justice. Demetrius Haley, guilty on counts 3 and 4, which is still obstruction of justice, but witness tampering was tied in that as well. Haley was also found guilty of 2 lesser charges, including deprivation of rights and bodily injury. The last suspect was Justin Smith, found guilty on count 4, again, obstruction of justice, and we noted that that could be up to 20 years in prison for that.
20 years for both of those counts, in fact. Civil rights violations, the unreasonable force violations, the deliberate indifference charges, found not guilty. All 3 officers found not guilty on all of those charges. So again, life in prison regarding the federal case, off the table for all 3. It's going to be a minute. I'm not exactly sure the timetable. We've got reporters in the newsroom, or not in the newsroom, but in the courtroom, I should say, that should be able to give us a little more information on exactly how long it's going to take before we see sentencing in this particular trial.
Mind you, all of this started on January 7th of 2023. It started that evening, in fact, where Tyre Nichols was pulled over. I believe it was in Hickory Hill.
It was.
And everything ensued.
Rains and
from that
Ross
point.
Road.
Yes, and he was only a block or 2 away from his home when all
And
this
only
happened.
a block or 2 from the Rains MPD station.
Precinct.
All right, let's go to Fox 13's Kayla Solomon. She has been covering this case since day one. Again, we're wrapping up almost 4 full weeks in a federal courtroom. Kayla, what can you tell us?
Well, I'll tell you one thing, that this verdict came down much sooner than we were all expecting. It took about 6 hours for the jury to reach the verdict. And I know Darcy and Daryl, you guys have been saying what those charges are, but all 3 defendants were found guilty of the conspiracy obstruction of justice charge, that count 4, and not guilty of the other charges instead. Now, we do know that one defendant, Demetrius Haley, was found guilty of both obstruction charges and the lesser charges when it comes to the unreasonable force. So at this point, what we're waiting for is to see exactly how the family is going to react, how the defense attorneys are going to react, and the prosecutors in this case. It has been a very long trial, almost exactly 4 weeks. It took 19 days to get to the point that we are at now. So at this point, we're waiting any moment moment for the family to come down, for those defense attorneys and prosecutors to come down. We do know that while the verdict was being read, the family was stoic in the courtroom. They did not have a reaction. They kept a straight face throughout this entire thing. And they've done the same throughout the entire trial, just as someone making observations within the courtroom. But again, these three defendants are guilty of the obstruction of justice charge, not guilty as charged for unreasonable force, but Demetrius Haley is guilty of lesser charges of causing bodily injury. So again, at this point, just waiting for the family and everyone else to come outside.
Kayla, I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but I would think that the prosecution has to be a little taken aback by this, given the case they laid out, plus the video that we've seen so many times, time and time again. But also, we can't get lost in the fact that these two charges, the obstruction of justice and the conspiracy to obstruct justice, those still carry significant prison time. So these officers are not getting off free.
Yeah, that's right. It's up to 20 years for each of those charges. But while the verdict was being read, you could see the look of surprise on the prosecutor's face, probably a little bit of disappointment as well. We did see one prosecutor, his face turned red while the verdict was being read by the judge. And he went through juror by juror and polled them to make sure that this was, in fact, a unanimous decision. And all of their answers were yes.
Kayla, curious. We have seen the video and the extent of it. We've also seen all of the pictures of Tyre Nichols while he was in the hospital. I believe that the defense made it very clear that these officers felt as if Tyre Nichols was a dangerous suspect, as if he was trying to get away, as if he was being combative. Did any of that play with the jury? Did you see anything on their faces that would make them think, well, maybe?
I know it was difficult at some point for jurors to watch the videos. We did see, just from where we were sitting, that one of the jurors ended up covering his ears, especially in parts of the video where you could hear Tyre calling for his mother on that body camera video. So you could see some of them did have reactions to the videos. But again, at this point, it looks like it didn't affect their decision much.
Okay, that is Fox 13's Kayla Solomon. She has been there again from the beginning of this court case. All of this started, of course, January 7th of last year. Kayla has been on this case since it first started. She's been in the courtroom, in fact, for the last 19 days on this case.
Kayla, do you expect the Nichols family to come out? Do you know if they're going to talk to the media? Have they made themselves available today, or do you know?
Yeah, I know this morning they did do a prayer circle, but they didn't indicate whether or not they were planning to speak after a verdict. So at this point, like I said, we're just waiting for them to come down and see if we can get them to comment at all on this case. I know their attorney, Ben Crump, we have not seen him today. We also haven't seen Antonio Romanucci, so their team of attorneys is not here, but we do know the family is here and they were in the courtroom.
Very good. Again, Kayla, stand by. We'll be joining you again in a moment. Here we are, 10 minutes, almost 11 minutes after 5 o'clock. Keep in mind, the jury was handed this case, as Kayla pointed out, just before 11 a.m. Mm-hmm. It took them almost a couple of hours this morning for Judge Mark Norris to read instructions to the jury, because there's a long procedural process in reading those instructions. It's not just go deliberate. So that happened. They were able to get the case, went back into the room, deliberated from 11 until about 4:15. That's when we found out that they had a verdict in this case. And typically, as Darcy and I were discussing, we were discussing in the newsroom earlier, typically the more quickly you get a verdict read,
you think that it's going to be,
the worse it is for the defendants. But here we are 5 hours in, and to reset the charges, to reset the verdict, I should say, in the death of Tyre Nichols. Again, this is the federal trial. This is not the murder trial. This is in the violation of civil rights and the obstruction of justice trial, if you will. To Darius Bean, former officer, deliberate indifference, not guilty. Conspiracy to obstruct, not guilty. Obstruction of justice, guilty. That carries a 20-year term.
We also have Demetrius Haley. Unreasonable force, guilty. Deprivation of rights, guilty. Conspiracy to obstruct, guilty. And obstruction of justice, guilty. The conspiracy to obstruct and obstruction of justice, those are the two charges that are 20 years, that he could face 20 years in prison. The lesser charges, unreasonable force and deprivation of rights. Again, both found guilty on those.
And of course, there were some reduced charges as well for Justin Smith. As we roll to his graphic, unreasonable force, not guilty. Deliberate indifference, also not guilty. Conspiracy to obstruct, not guilty. Obstruction of justice, guilty. And what were the other charges, Darcy?
The two charges for Demetrius Haley, the lesser charges, deprivation of rights.
That was Haley.
But also
Gotcha.
causing bodily harm.
Gotcha,
He's
gotcha.
found guilty on those two charges, the lesser charges as well.
So that's where we stand. You just heard Fox 13's Kayla Solomon, who's been in the courtroom since the very beginning, since they began selecting a jury, describe the faces of the defense attorneys, the prosecution, the federal prosecutors. One seemed angry, the other shocked. And I think that I think that there are a lot of people who are going to be shocked at the way this played out. But after 4 weeks, here we are.
Yeah. We're also wondering when they're going to be sentenced. That's one of the things people have been talking about. We're going to toss it back to Fox 13's Kayla Solomon, who joins us. She has been at federal court for the last 19 days. She has been in front of this case, and she brings us more. Kayla, we're trying to find out, do you finally have a sentencing date?
Yeah, so we do know the sentencing date was set for January of next year. So we know in that time that they will be out just waiting to be sentenced. And that state case is still slated to happen in February. And of course, that state case has to do with a second-degree murder charge. So at this point, we know the sentencing will happen just a few weeks before that state case is set to start.
So that could be at some point in February, if not some point in January, where the state case, where the sentencing will happen for these federal charges.
Kayla, if you would, again, given the fact that you have been there since day one, you've covered this story since day one, January 7, 2023. And I know it's all still very fresh on your mind. I would like to just get your general impressions of, more specifically, this past week, closing arguments that led us up to this point today. What were your impressions? What were you left with as the jury began their deliberations?
I'll tell you what, we were watching the jurors' faces as closing arguments were happening just to see if anybody had any strong reactions or any reaction at all. And they were difficult to read. They did not give a reaction to any of the defense attorneys' arguments, nor did they give any reaction to what prosecutors had to say. But we did hear, of course, each defense attorney had the opportunity to plead their final case to the jury for this. And the jury, like I said, they've also been straight-faced, but they were instructed to be pretty stoic the entire case. They didn't want to see any reaction. The judge instructed them that any strong reactions could be a problem. And he said the same things to everyone in the gallery, as far as the family members go, as far as community activists who also showed up to attend the trial. Everyone across the board, difficult to read throughout this entire court case. And we finally see today it led all up to this verdict.
I know that the three defendants, none of them have spoken to the media at all. We're talking about Justin Smith, Darius Bean, and of course Demetrius Haley. But I'm curious if they had a reaction, especially to the count 4 of obstruction of justice, knowing that that's possibly 20 years behind bars. Did they react at all? Because we also know, Kayla, that I believe that Desmond Mills broke down on the stand. So how did these other three defendants react?
Yeah, at this point, you couldn't see much of a reaction from them either. It's probably likely they were also told not to give much of a reaction by each of their attorneys, but you could see attorneys were feeling a little relieved as the verdict was read. And of course, in this case where you have the charge of unreasonable force and then the lesser charge of bodily injury, you know, we did see what happened in that case, especially with defendant Haley. At this point, we want to see what defendant Haley's attorney has to say specifically, because he was found guilty of those two lesser charges of causing bodily harm, as well as the 2 obstruction of justice charges. So right now it looks like he's going to be facing the most prison time in this case.
One of the interesting facets of this case, too, Kayla, are the 2 defendants that pled guilty, those 2 other officers, Emmett Martin, Desmond Mills. I mean, there's already been recommendations laid out that Martin should face 40 years in prison, Mills 15 years through the guilty plea. How do you think that's going to play out? I mean, they've yet to be sentenced. I'm assuming that they will be sentenced with this group of 3. Is that correct?
No, so each of them actually has a different sentencing date. So Mills pleaded guilty first. He pleaded guilty just 2 months after these federal charges came down, and he pleaded guilty to 2 of the charges, one for unreasonable force for using his baton and the other for the obstruction of justice and conspiracy. And the recommended time for him was about 15 years. And Emmett Martin pleaded guilty just weeks before this trial began, also to 2 of the charges as charged, and his recommendation set by the prosecution was about a 40-year prison sentence. So it'll be interesting to see how much the judge takes into account their testimony, as well as what those recommended sentences will have to do when it comes to sentencing the 3 that did go to trial.
Again, a very interesting facet of this case. 2 of the 5 pled guilty, and looks like they're all going to face about the same amount of time in prison after all. You would think that the guilty pleas and the idea to cooperate with the prosecution would buy you much less time than the defendants in a case like this, but this time it did not.
And they're still facing state charges.
There's state charges left to go, second-degree murder charges. I mean, the second-degree murder charge itself, if they're found guilty of that, you're looking at 60 years in prison as a maximum. So there's still as my father used to say, there's many a slip between the cup and the lip. There's a long way to go before all of this is actually prosecuted and taken out to the fullest extent of the law. You know what, let's take a look at the jury breakdown again. 12 people on the jury. There were 2 alternates in this case, and this was the breakdown: 4 white men, 3 white women, 4 black women, 2 black men, 1 black man, 1 Asian as alternates. So the racial and gender makeup of the jury seems it was agreed upon very quickly. They actually sat this jury much more quickly than they thought they might.
They did.
If you remember
they thought
that,
it was going to take some time because they had so many jurors to choose from, but it took just a few days, and they had them all seated.
They had a pool of over 200, and in about a day and a half, they went through the voir dire process and had a jury seated and began this trial pretty judiciously.
We all thought that all of the jurors were going to come from Shelby County, but they did not. They came from Lauderdale County, Tipton County, some from Shelby County, but also some from Fayette County as well. So a wide variety of jurors that they had a chance to choose from.
Well, defense attorneys had pressed time and time again to have this case moved. They wanted the federal case moved simply because of the media attention. They pled the case that they could not get a fair trial in Memphis because of the media attention, and that was shot down very, very quickly.
Judge said no.
So again, let's recap one more time as we're now 20 minutes into this broadcast, and we have a verdict. We have 3 verdicts, if you will, in the civil trial. The federal trial in the death of Tyre Nichols. So we're being told. Hold on one second.
It looks like family is coming out.
Let's go there live. Let's listen in.
All of them have been convicted of something, and they're all going to jail. That's how I feel. This has been a long journey for our family. I'm actually in shock right now because I still can't believe all this stuff is going on. But we're happy that they all have been convicted and they have been arrested.
And that's very important, that the jury found all of them in some way participated in a crime, and that Tyre Nichols' death won't go unaccounted for. That is critical. We know that this is the federal case. It's different from the state case, but in the federal court, all 5 of them, 2 pled guilty, 3 of them have been found guilty of charges, and they all, as the judge articulated, have been taken into custody. So the family was very relieved that the killers of Tyre Nichols have been taken into custody and have been found guilty. Now you will hear from Attorney Tony Romanucci before any of the other family members may speak.
Thank you, everybody. Today was monumentous because you had 2 defendants who pled guilty to deprivation of rights under color of law. They testified in this courtroom. The remaining defendants have all been found guilty of 1 charge or more: obstruction, conspiracy, deprivation of rights causing bodily injury. This is justice for Tyre. This is a very high burden that this government had in order to prove 12 counts against all of these individuals, and they proved more than half of them.
That's right.
So we are grateful to the federal government. We're grateful to the jury for paying attention, His Honor for a clean trial, and now we look forward to justice. We look forward to the state case, the civil case, because what we know is these officers conspired.
That's right.
They made an agreement.
That's right.
They made an agreement to cause harm, and now they are in jail. They are.
Man. Mr.
You're
Rodney,
going to
your
hear
response?
from Mr. Wells in just a minute. It's very important that we thank Christian Clark
Yes.
and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice for bringing these charges and zealously prosecuting this case. Now you will hear from Mr. Rodney Wells, the father of Tyre Nichols.
I just want to say for the family that we are all elated. We're all very, very happy that these guys have been put in jail. This is a long time coming. And justice for Tyre. So we're just so very proud that all of them are going to jail today. We cannot wait on the sentencing, so we'll know what their total time will be. But today was a very good day for our family.
And
You
now
all
you
have
will
been
hear
here every
from
day.
Judge Ernestine Doris, who will make a statement for you hear from his uncle.
Today is a day that we, in fact, got justice for Tyre, and I'd just like to thank the government for their work in getting this done and their diligence and the way that this matter was held and handled before the court so that we know that, notwithstanding anything that we think, there is justice.
Yes.
It is very important to note that all of them were pointing the fingers at each other. So all of them said that the others had something to do with the death of Tyre Nichols. That is very important, especially as we go forward to the other cases, whether it be the state criminal charge, but especially the civil case, the wrongful death civil rights violation, because the violation of Tyre Nichols' civil rights led to his death, and the blood is on the hand of the Memphis Police Department. That's right. And we're thankful to the jury for this first step of justice. Now you will hear from his Uncle Johnny.
First and foremost, I'd just like to thank you all for being here for our family. I thank the federal government. They really worked very hard for Tyre. And I'd like to thank God for watching over us and for our families. And, like they said, they're all in prison. They're not getting out anytime soon, and it's not over. I'd just like to say, let this be a message to all officers, that, you will reap what you sow.
That's right.
You just can't go around hurting people and think that you're not going to be accountable for it. So let this be a message, because Tyre's death did not go in vain. And that's all I'd like to
Now
say.
you hear from his sister, Kiana. I'm sorry. Kiana, you want
I just want to say, I don't know if I'm happy, but it's a bittersweet day. I will never get my little brother back, but to see those officers held accountable for what they did and put our family through did give us some hope for the future, and maybe this won't ever happen to another family in the future, but I just so thankful. I was smiling when I saw them get taken away into custody, because that's part of that's just one of the things that they did with him. What they did to my brother was wrong, and to see them go into custody and be held accountable was anything and everything that my family could ask for.
Justice for Tyre Nichols.
Justice for Tyre Nichols.
We'd like to thank all the activists, all the state representatives, everybody, all the faith-based community, everybody who stood for justice, to say that Tyre deserved humanity, Tyre deserved his constitutional rights, and Tyre deserved to get home to his mother and father. Ms. Rovan, would you like to say the last word?
I just want to say to all of you guys, thank you so much for covering the story the correct way. And I appreciate the love and everything that you guys have given our family, and to the communities of Memphis. Thank you for all the prayers and all the love. Just thank you so much. We appreciate it all.
Anything else, Kareem? Anything else, family?
Nope.
Justice for Tyre Nichols. Justice for Tyre Nichols. Justice for Tyre Nichols.
Attorney Ben
Justice for
Crump.
Tyre Nichols.
Justice for Tyre
Heard from him. You heard from Attorney Ramanucci. You heard from Tyre's mother and father, Rovan Wells and Rodney Wells, his uncle, his sister, many of them out
their
there.
deliberations of who should be punished most severely. We know that Martin and Haley and those all pointed the fingers at each other. And not only they're going to have to answer to the judge when he sentences them, most importantly, they're going to have to answer to God.
That's right. Right. Antonio Crump, you all wanted a guilty verdict on all accounts, correct?
We got, and that's what I was sitting there holding hands with Mr. Wells and Miss Wells, and when they heard a guilty conviction for each one of them, they thanked God right there as they were sitting in the courtroom. But then, when the judge said, U.S. Marshals, take them all into custody, Mr. Wells said, thank God, all of them going to jail for what they did to my boy.
Thank you.
Justice for Tyre.
Justice for Tyre.
Justice for Tyre.
Justice for Tyre.
Heard from, that was Attorney Ben Crump, who has been with the family since the very beginning. We also heard, as you said, from Darcy, from Tony Romanucci, a defense attorney. He had some of the most poignant words, if you will. He said, today was monumental. This is justice for Tyre.
12 counts is where it started.
12 counts. And they got guilty verdicts on 6 of them. And the family said, you heard Rovon Wells say it first. The mother of Tyre Nichols stepped to the microphone first out of that group and said, we are happy. We have guilty verdicts. And it was Rodney Wells who followed that up by saying, the U.S. Marshals are taking them into custody. What more could we ask for?
I believe it was Tyre's uncle who says you reap what you sow. You cannot go around and not be held accountable. Rovon says she is elated, and this has been a long time coming, and the family together said justice for Tyre.
So again, it's very, as you continue to see the final charges and the verdict flash up on your screen, we roll through these 3 defendants. It's very important to point out that while yes, there were not guilty verdicts on the unreasonable force charges and the deliberate indifference charges, the guilty verdicts in the obstruction of justice charges and conspiracy to obstruct justice charges each carry 20 years in prison as a maximum. So there are 2 of the 3 individuals that could be facing up to 40 years in prison. That notwithstanding, the state trial has yet to begun. That's where, if you will, not to take any gravity away from this 4-week federal trial, but that's where they will all stand trial on second-degree murder charges with a maximum sentence of 60 years, not to mention other charges that the state has filed in regards to this case.
We're going to go back out to Fox 13's Kayla Solomon. Again, she has been on top of the story from the very beginning. She's been in the courtroom for the last 19 days. Kayla, so much emotion coming from Tyre Nichols' family, but also his attorneys as well.
Yeah, you heard it there from attorneys Ben Crump and Antonio Romanucci, as well as Rodney and Rovon Wells, the parents of Tyre Nichols, saying that although they weren't found guilty on all charges, they were thrilled that each person was found guilty of at least one charge. And right after that verdict came down, U.S. Marshals took each man into custody. So at this point, the question is, how much of a sentence will the judge give them? We know they were all found guilty of that obstruction of justice charge and conspiracy, and that carries a sentence of up to 20 years in federal prison. And of course, once the state trial happens next year, there could be additional time in state prison as well.
Yeah, Kayla, that was one of the things we were discussing as well. And I don't want to get too deep into the minutia, but when that state trial does begin, of course, everyone is going to be focused on the second-degree murder charges. But just like the federal trial, there are other charges in that case as well. This is going to be very significant.
Yeah, and again, the state charges also have to do with the cover-up that each former officer did that night. Now, we know that these same 3 defendants will be part of that state trial, as Emmett Martin and Desmond Mills already pleaded guilty, and that guilty plea will potentially carry over to the state case as well.
We know that these former officers are going to be sentenced, at least in this federal trial, at some point in February. At that point, that's when the state case begins. Again, we talked about second-degree murder, but they're also looking at aggravated assault, 2 charges of aggravated kidnapping, 2 charges of official misconduct, and 1 charge of official oppression as well.
And that's not to mention the civil lawsuit, which the burden of proof in a civil lawsuit is different than a criminal trial. So that 3rd trial in federal court, which goes back to federal court, is going to look really a lot different than these 2 previous trials, as this one looks different than the state trial, which is coming up, as Kayla said at the beginning, of the year. So, Kayla, I wanted to get your take on one more thing. You know, again, we talked about the fact that a lot of people really expected, I think the general public really expected to see more guilty verdicts. They expected those obstruction charges to come back with a guilty verdict. Benjamin Crump seemed jubilant with the fact that they did get 6 of the 12 charges. They did get guilty verdicts on 6 of the 12.
Well, Kayla, before you answer, I also feel that Tyre Nichols' parents,
Yeah.
they felt
Yeah.
like, okay, we at least got guilty on something.
Yeah, part of that is, and you heard Attorney Crump say it, the burden of proof is much higher in a federal case, especially a criminal case like this one. So they just wanted some form of a guilty plea so that each person could be sentenced to prison, although we don't know how long that will be at this point. They just wanted some form of accountability. You heard them say that word multiple times during that media scrum we just had, but they just wanted some form of accountability. So the fact that each person was found guilty of at least one count, that says a lot. They also implied the fact that brings the tally up to all 5 who will be serving some sort of prison time in this case.
I also heard, when Ben Crump said, when Judge Norris made it very clear, U.S. Marshals take all defendants into custody.
Did we
He said at
expect
point-
that? Kayla, did we expect them to be taken into custody
Right then and there?
immediately, or did we expect there to be an easement?
No, it's different from every courtroom, it's different from every judge. So when you do hear for a U.S. Marshal to immediately take someone into custody, it is a little surprising, especially considering that their sentencing isn't until January. So that's partially why the family said they felt a little bit of joy in this very gloomy situation. Of course, they can't get their son back, they can't get their brother back, but what they can do is know that 3 of the people found guilty of a charge that led up to Tyre Nichols' death, they are being held in custody for the time being.
Okay, that is Fox 13's Kayla Solomon reporting live at federal court. Of course, we're going to go back to Kayla shortly.
Absolutely. So the words of the day coming from the family of Tyre Nichols. Rovon Wells, happy with a guilty verdict.
Elated.
She said, thank God. Rodney Wells, elated, proud you're all going to jail today. Speaking of the 3 officers who were facing the charges in this federal trial. Of course, there were 5, but 2 had pled guilty and actually turned state's evidence and testified against the other 3. And Benjamin Crump, and that was really where I wanted Kayla to go, because one of the things I think a lot of people don't understand, and maybe I didn't have a full comprehension of the fact, is the burden of proof at the federal level is very different than it is at the state level, and what they're going to face in those murder charges here in Shelby County. Federal prosecutors really had a job before them to get to this level and to get guilty verdicts in 6 of the 12 charges.
They did. Again, 3 defendants, 3 former Memphis police officers, Justin Smith, Tadarius Bean, Demetrius Haley. They have all been found guilty of a charge, some more than one charge. Tadarius Bean, guilty on count 4, which was obstruction of justice. Demetrius Haley was found guilty on counts 3 and 4, which I believe was conspiracy to witness tamper and obstruction of justice. Demetrius Haley, again, found guilty. I take that back. Demetrius Haley found guilty on charges 3 and 4, but he was also found guilty on 2 lesser charges, deprivation of rights, but also causing bodily harm. And Justin Smith, facing 1 count, obstruction of justice. He was found not guilty on the first 3 counts.
And we have to remember, this has been just over a year and a half in the making, almost 2 years in the making. This all began January 7th. It was a Saturday night back in 2023. That's where officers stopped Tyre Nichols at a traffic stop, an initial traffic stop as it was described by officers. He did stop. He seemed to comply, but then was pulled out of the car. He was pepper sprayed, and he ran away from that incident. He ran away from that scene. He ran from the officers down the block, only 2 blocks from his home. And here's where it ended.
He was so close. And in the video, we know that he was kicked, beaten, tased, pepper sprayed as well.
Yeah, this is the corner of Castlegate Lane and Bear Creek Cove. He was within shouting distance of his mother's house. This is a Skycop camera that captured these still frame pictures that you see. And one of the big arguments that the prosecution laid out, and you're probably going to hear this time and time again in the state trial, is that no one on the scene, none of the officers immediately rendered aid. After he was incapacitated and seemingly unconscious, none of those officers did anything to help. Of course, there are EMTs, fire department members who have also
Lost their jobs.
They've lost their jobs. They faced suspensions and then lost their jobs because it was determined by their employers, the city of Memphis, they did not render aid in a timely manner. And that's where that indifference charge seems to start to tie in. It was 3 days afterwards, after this beating, on Saturday, January 7th. January 10th, Tyre Nichols died of his wounds in the hospital.
Which were severe. They were very extreme. I believe that his mother also made it very clear that her son had swelling of the brain, kidney failure because of his injuries. They were extreme, to say the least.
He had heart injuries. He had internal injuries that are undescribable unless you were in a major car wreck. Of course, that led to you do have to give the Shelby County District Attorney's Office and the MPD credit for the fact they released all available video as quickly as they could. Pictures, still frame pictures. You saw the Skycop just a moment ago. We've seen body camera footage as you take a look at some of Tyre Nichols' photography work. He was known to be a photographer in the neighborhood.
Skateboarder.
All of that was laid out very, very quickly for the public to see. So you do have to give credit for that. But soon after that, the MPD Scorpion unit, which was charged with high-value crimes, they were soon disbanded.
But we're talking about auto theft. We're talking about searching down gang members. We're talking about searching
high-value
drugs.
Crimes.
High-value crimes.
Right.
And I believe it was Interim Police Chief C.J. Davis that said what he was pulled over initially for was a misdemeanor, not a high-value crime, not being a part of a gang, not for drugs, not auto theft, not for guns, but a misdemeanor. And this is where we are today.
And the officers testified in court that they were angry that night because they had been pepper sprayed themselves as part of this process.
Also that he tried to run.
And that he did flee police. His mother said time and time again that he was simply terrified and had no understanding of what was happening to him.
So while we wait for the sentencing, which will happen early next year, we also wait for the state charges that these officers will be facing as well.
I believe we still have Fox 13's Kayla Solomon. Nope, we do not. We've got Kayla down there. She's working on getting reaction. I would imagine she's waiting on prosecutors to come out and possibly defense attorneys. Actually, we do have Kayla. Kayla, is there any indication at all that you're going to hear from either A, the prosecution, or B, defense attorneys as well?
Yeah, at this point, it's unclear. We've been standing out here for about 20 minutes now, and we still have not seen any of the prosecutors come out. We also haven't seen any of the defense attorneys. But I will divert your attention over here across the street. The family of Tyre Nichols and some of the activists are still over there. There are supporters that came out here yelling justice for Tyre Nichols during this entire thing. Now, I want to tell you also that we heard from the family. We heard their thoughts on the verdict. We also heard everything that they felt. They said they were just happy that each defendant was found guilty of at least one charge, and they were immediately taken into custody. So again, we've heard from the family, we've heard from attorneys, in this case the attorneys for the Nichols family rather, and at this point we're just waiting to see if any of the defense attorneys will come out and speak, any of the prosecutors, either from the DOJ or from the local office here, the AUSA's office. So yeah, we're still waiting out here for them. And of course, once we do have that, we'll attempt to get comments from them because each of their clients were immediately taken into custody.
Kayla, you mentioned, actually, you showed us just a moment ago that small group of people who were across the street. You know, throughout this trial, I don't think we've seen many protesters. We haven't seen that many people on the street just speaking their voice about what's going on inside that building. Have you?
Yeah, there's actually been community activists in the courtroom every single day. I think out of respect for the family, they were deciding not really to speak publicly, but the entire time they've been here every day, sitting in the courtroom with the family. And every day we've seen them walk in with the family and leave. So they have been very present, but of course they're leaving it up to the family to do the talking as well as the attorneys.
All right, very good.
That is Fox 13's Kayla Solomon reporting live. Of course, we're going to continue to talk to Kayla throughout our newscast tonight.
Stay on standby, Kayla, because as soon as those attorneys walk out, we would love to hear from, there were three sides to this case. There's the family, not three sides, but three facets, if you will, three angles. The family who we've heard from. The defense attorneys, it's going to be interesting to get their take. And of course, federal prosecutors. We thought initially they might be a little disappointed with this verdict, but maybe not, getting 6 guilties out of 12 charges. According to Benjamin Crump, as he just said, that's actually a really good day in federal court, and that he feels justice was served for Tyre.
We definitely thought that some of the other counts, they were definitely going to find them guilty on, but they did not. But it was the reaction from Ben Crump, from Attorney Ramanucci, and even the family that was a little shocking. I just thought that they were going to be more upset, but they weren't. They were just happy that these officers were found guilty on something.
And I think that Tony Ramanucci and Ben Crump probably prepped them for this because, they've been here, done this. And I would imagine, I'm not there, I haven't been privy to any of these conversations, but I would imagine that both Crump and Ramanucci said, hey, this is probably how it's going to go down. And if we get a guilty verdict on any of the 4 charges, we're really doing something special.
Especially being a federal case.
That's exactly because the bar is so high on a federal case. In fact, let's go to Benjamin Crump, because just a moment ago when he came out of the courthouse about 20 minutes ago, he did a pretty good job of explaining exactly how and why the family is pleased with this verdict.
This has been a long journey for our family. I'm actually in shock right now because I still can't believe all this stuff is going on. But we're happy that they all have been convicted and they have been arrested.
And that's very important, that the jury found all of them in some way participated in a crime, and that Tyre Nichols' death won't go unaccounted for.
We also heard from Tyre Nichols' sister, who was out there with the family today. This has to be somewhat of a relief for her. She said she was very close to Tyre Nichols, and she says for her, this looks like justice for her.
What they did to my brother was wrong, and to see them go into custody and be held accountable was anything and everything that my family could ask for.
Kenya Dixon.
So again, the family?
Pleased.
Very pleased.
Pleased at the guilty verdicts.
With the fact that these individuals, again, were, taken out of court, led away by U.S. Marshals in handcuffs, and they will immediately go into the federal system.
Be behind bars.
Of course, that sentencing, as Kayla has pointed out, Fox 13's Kayla Solomon, who's been knee-deep in this trial since the very beginning, explained that sentencing is yet to come. And there will be 2 other dates for the other 2 individuals, the other 2 former officers who actually turned to state's evidence, if you will, and they testified against the 3 who were on trial here in this federal system. All of the sentencing are going to be separate, so that's yet to come. But up to 20 years on each count they were found guilty on.
The obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and then the 2 lesser charges, which were the excessive force and deliberate indifference, which I believe Demetrius Haley.
Right. And of course, keep in mind, and we pointed it out, but we have to keep reminding everyone, we have to keep reminding ourselves, this is just the first step out of 3 for all of these 5 officers. Up next is the state trial. That's going to begin at the beginning of the year. The state trial is where you're going to see, as Kayla Solomon pointed out right at the bottom of the hour at 5:30, the second-degree murder charges along with more obstruction charges. So that second-degree murder charge carries a maximum of 60 years in prison, and all 5 are going to face that. So there's still a lot at play here. We're far from done.
There was so much reaction in our newsroom, and Kayla said there was reaction even on the street. We're going to turn to Fox 13's Jack Bilyeu, who's also down at federal court today and has reaction as well. Jack.
Yeah, good evening, guys. We're over here on the opposite side of the federal building as Tyre Nichols' family loaded up in the car to head off. We saw his mother, Rovon Wells, giving a lot of hugs. One thing they said Attorney Crump said during his brief media availability after the hearing was to express thanks to all the activists who were involved in this. And of course, I mean, as y'all saw during those live interviews, they were surrounded by those activists. We got a chance to speak to a couple of them as the scene here was kind of breaking down and people were heading home. The big thing that they all stressed to us was that this is far from over. The federal side of things is over, but we've still got civil cases ahead. We've still got the state charges, and they tell us they plan to be here the whole time. And it's the same thing with that family. I mean, the closure that they got here today, there's still a lot ahead of them. This is far from over.
All right, Jack, that's Fox 13's Jack Bilyeu live outside the federal courthouse. Forgive us, we're taken off guard there. We're getting a lot of information pouring into our ears. Yes. Jack, stand by. We're going to be coming back to you here in just a moment because, again, we did not expect, of course, at anytime the jury's handed the case, a verdict could come along very quickly. But we did not expect this to come down as quickly as it did because the jury did not get this case until just before 11 a.m. today. And they deliberated for roughly 5 hours, about 5 hours, 15 minutes, because we found out about, 4:15? That's when Kayla texted and said, hey, we've got a verdict. And it takes time. The judge has to call everybody back into the courtroom, get everybody set, reseat the jury, and then ask for those verdicts. And he faced each defendant one by one. He didn't read them off en masse. They read them off one by one. So again, here about 12 minutes before 6 o'clock, let's reset and show you the verdicts. Again, some guilty, some not guilty. Can we pop them up on screen really fast so we can go through the verdicts?
The 3 officers. There
we go. That's to Darius Bean. The unreasonable force charge, not guilty. Deliberate indifference, not guilty. Conspiracy to obstruct, not guilty. But to Darius Bean was found guilty on a specific obstruction of justice charge.
We also have Demetrius Haley. Unreasonable force, guilty. Deprivation of rights, guilty. Those are the 2 lesser charges. Conspiracy to obstruct, guilty. Obstruction of justice, guilty. Those last 2 charges, again, 20 years apiece.
Now, as for the charges against Justin Smith, he was found not guilty of unreasonable force and deliberate indifference, as well as conspiracy to obstruct, but was found guilty on obstruction of justice charges. So there you have it. 6 of the 12 charges that were laid out in federal court, the prosecution did get guilty verdicts in 6. And again, all 5, including the 2 who pled out on the way into this case, are looking at prison time. And here's what they're looking at. On the conspiracy to obstruct, 20 years. Obstruction of justice, 20 years. That conspiracy to obstruct means that they talked among themselves. Right. That's the conspiracy, the conspiratorial act, if you will. So they could be facing, some of these guys could be facing up to 40 years in prison. Of course, those sentencings are set to come at the very beginning of the year.
And then at that point, they will now begin the state charges that they will be facing as well. That case is expected to start possibly sometime in the month of February. And of course, we will be there. Just like we were there for this federal trial, we will be at that state trial as well.
Just like we were outside the courtroom as the family walked out and expressed their relief and their jubilation that they did get guilty verdicts and that all 5 of these individuals will face prison time for the death of Tyre Nichols. Let's play it back. Let's listen to Tyre Nichols' uncle and his explanation of his feeling after this day.
Let this be a message to all officers, that, you will reap what you sow.
That's right.
You just can't go around hurting people and think that you're not going to be accountable for it. So let this be a message because Tyre's death did not go in vain.
Tyre's death did not go in vain. Memphis Police Chief, Inter Police Chief C.J. Davis, I do remember when the video came out, when it first came out, and I remember that she approached the media saying that what she saw, she called it heinous and she called it reckless behavior from her officers. We also have sound tonight from MPD. Let's take a listen. From the city of Memphis, rather.
Oh, actually,
from the city of Memphis.
We got a statement, and it's not much.
It's not much at all.
From the Memphis Police Department, a spokesperson, and again, understanding this is litigation. The quote, as standard practice, we do not comment on pending litigation. Now, even though we have a verdict in this specific trial, the federal trial, there are still 2 more trials to go. There's a state trial against the 5 officers where they'll face those murder charges, plus probably the big one on behalf of the MPD and the city is that federal trial coming up, number 3 there in federal court, the civil lawsuit where the family of Tyre Nichols is seeking $550 million in damages against the city, the MPD, and there are individuals named within that trial as well. So we would not expect either the city or the MPD to be able to say anything, given the fact that there's still a long way to go in court.
And as you said, there's a long way to go. This is not the end. Now that this federal trial has wrapped itself up, this is not the end, because you still have 2 more trials that these officers are going to be facing as well.
And given that, let's go back to Fox 13's Kayla Solomon. Kayla, if you can, just give us your perspective here. How do these guilty verdicts, and even the not guilty verdicts against these 3 officers, play into that state trial, or will they at all? Or are they allowed to be considered?
Yeah, them all being found guilty of one obstruction of justice charge shows that the jurors all agreed that they did have a conspiracy after the fact, which means they did attempt to cover it up. So we know that that's the one charge they were all found guilty of. But again, for the unreasonable force and the deliberate indifference, the fact that both Tadarius Bean and Justin Smith were found not guilty of those and also not guilty of the lesser charge, it shows that their defense attorneys were effective when they were telling the jurors that this was not meant to kill Tyre Nichols. No one denied that there were pieces that went, and that's one of the terms that Justin Smith used in the body-worn camera. There's also no denying that they each were trying to take down Tyre Nichols, and that a beating even happened. So all defense attorneys acknowledged that. But what they told the jurors were that their clients did less than some of the other defendants in this case. Now, Demetrius Haley was found guilty of all 4 charges to some degree. Now, the second charge and the first charge have to do with that unreasonable force and deliberate indifference. He was found guilty of causing bodily harm, which is just a degree lower than death. And we know that the sentencing could be a little different because of that little distinction that we have there. But we saw on video as Demetrius Haley did kick Tyre Nichols. Out of the 3 defendants, he was the one that we saw take a kick at Nichols' body as it was on the ground in that body-worn camera. So that is probably what had an effect on the jurors in this case.
I'm sure. Yeah, that's Fox 13's Kayla Solomon. Kayla, thank you for the explanation there. You know, again, one of the things that further complicated this, the jury had to examine each officer's actions separately. And, you know, as it's been explained to us time and time again through this process, the federal trials are very different in the fact that the burden of proof on behalf of the prosecution is very different. There's a very high bar. That's exactly what you heard Benjamin Crump say as he came out talking about the fact that they did get guilty charges on 6 of the 12 charges. So there's a very high bar. And when you take those officers' actions separately, it's hard to separate those out. You know, when you're watching that video.
When you're watching the video.
I mean, it's been difficult for us because, you know, I remember when we first saw it, compared to the 100th time we saw it, every time it was like, my gosh, how do you do that? And then they have to determine if each respective former officer is guilty or innocent of each charge against them. So that jury had the responsibility of literally having to take this case, spread out over a 4-week time period, and put it into individual buckets. And if you've ever seen a juror's notepad, especially in a federal trial,
it can look like this.
Pages and pages and pages of notes, and then they have to go through and try to figure out all of these separate buckets to come to those verdicts.
But you know how we felt watching the video. But as a juror, you're watching it again and again, slowing it down. You know, the defense attorneys, they also had to focus on their client. This is my client. He's not doing this, or he may be doing this.
Right.
But this is their client over there. Look what they're doing. So again, they literally had to look at each defendant and determine their impact, their action that led to Tyre Nichols' death.
So here we are, again, guilty on 6 of the 12 charges against those 3 defendants, 3 former MPD officers who were all facing that jury over the past 4 weeks. Let's take one more look at the jury makeup if we have that available, because I think it's important to note that this jury was not only made up of equal parts, if you will, as far as gender and race, but keep in mind this was not a Shelby County only jury. So if we'll take a look there, I believe we've got it somewhere.
I believe they came from Lauderdale,
No.
Fayette
These are-
County, and Tipton County.
Yep. Again, 12 jurors, 2 alternates, equal men and women. The racial divide was also equal. So, and again, we said this earlier, Darcy, we were all taken aback a little bit of the fact that this jury was seated so quickly in just a day and a half. Typically that voir dire process, the selection of the jury, it takes more time than that, because they had a pool of over 200 people to pull from that they selected out of, obviously hundreds of thousands of people. So to come to agreement on a jury that quickly said something for the veracity of this case.
But we know that these 3 officers will be heading to prison.
Absolutely. Those 3 officers were remanded into custody. Judge Mark Norris told the marshals to take them into custody immediately and lead them straight back into the jail system. They're now in the federal system.